Development began on Resident Evil Village 6 months before Resident Evil 7 had even shipped. Morimasa Sato, a new hire who had largely been responsible for the creation and implementation of Jack Baker, was tasked with directing the sequel rather than Koshi Nakanishi, the director of Resident Evil 7. This decision to prematurely kickstart development of the sequel left Sato uncertain as to what he should do, as Capcom didn't even know how fans would respond to the first-person perspective or new direction yet. As such, Sato drew inspiration from Resident Evil 4, beginning with a European village setting. After Resident Evil 7 released to be a critical and commercial success, it confirmed the decision to continue forward with Ethan's story, especially as Sato had grown attached to the character during 7's development. According to concept art included in Village, an attempt to adhere closer to 7's gameplay style had been experimented with in the early days, but gave way to the more complete inspiration of Resident Evil 4 through its action combat after feedback from fans and players found Resident Evil 7 too scary to complete. So, is Resident Evil Village a good sequel, or is it a bad sequel? Is it even a worthwhile successor to Resident Evil 4 as Resident Evil 7 attempted to be of the original? This puts me in an odd position because I honestly love this game. I've already played it far more than any other Resident Evil title except for Resident Evil 4 itself. However, do I enjoy Village as a Resident Evil, or do I enjoy it as a game? The two ideas are not necessarily the same thing. As usual, I'll be spoiling the game thoroughly as I try to contemplate this question and dissect Resident Evil Village's design. We'll be going topic by topic and segment by segment looking into the developer intent, the execution, and how Resident Evil Village measures up. Let's get started with the game structure. In an interview with IGN back in April of 2021, Capcom described the direction of the game's world as a theme park of horror. I think this approach is precisely why I came to love this game as much as I do. Variety is the spice of life, and the development team aimed to make each layer of the four lords as unique as possible. We begin with the Vampire's Castle, a Metroidvania mansion in the spirit of the original games with the added twist of the wandering monsters of Resident Evil 7. The haunted house filled with escape room puzzles, a creepy atmosphere, and a terrifying creature the player cannot possibly fight back against. The death-defying chase from the horrific sea beast. A nerve-wracking climb up Frankenstein's factory of frightful creations only to conclude with a mechanized tank battle. In between each layer, the player finds themselves wandering the village grounds in search of treasure, keys, and the path forward while fending off the werewolves that now overrun the European hamlet. What makes this theme park approach work is the manner in which it paces the content of the game. The player is never stuck in one type of experience for too long. After surviving a fight against a draconic monstrosity in the castle and tackling a few more lycans in the village, the player may start feeling a bit too comfortable with their strength and prowess. As such, the developers take away the player's weapons and put them up against a giant fetus that can swallow them whole. It's an intentional shift in tone and pacing, and the flight from a giant fishman, assault on the Lycan stronghold, and investigation of Heisenberg's factory all have a different atmosphere and intensity to them than the area prior. I've heard of Resident Evil Village referred to as a greatest hits compilation of the franchise experiences and philosophy, and I can certainly see that perspective. To me, however, this theme park of horror actually begins somewhat with Resident Evil 7. From the guest house to the main house, from hiding from Jack or Marguerite to blasting away at Molded, and even to solving a sadistic escape room puzzle, Resident Evil 7 had already been designed to pace the player and provide a sense of variety in the experience. However, Resident Evil 7 did it in a more consistent, tension-focused fashion. In turn, while Resident Evil Village has an emphasis on tension in its own right, it doesn't execute on the idea in the same consistent manner. How it builds tension depends on what that portion of the theme park, so to speak, requires. The opening, for example, wants to build tension by having Ethan wander through a forest, getting creeped out and jump scared by strung up crows and visions of creatures in the darkness, sounds and sights that indicate something is there until, finally, breaking the tension with the Lycan reveal. The building of tension drops and then immediately accelerates again into an assault on a house, until it drops once more into the creepy sight of Lycans perched on rooftops, watching, waiting, and finally attacking in an attempt to recreate the village assault from Resident Evil 4. To put it another way, a lot of Resident Evil Village's tension building is immediate and set-piece oriented, whereas Resident Evil 7 was a careful crescendo not just to specific moments, but throughout the entire game. Village is rapidly building from next to next to next. It is most consistent in the game's opening, where the player is being directed towards a linear destination, but once the player escapes Mother Miranda's family and the Lycans and makes their way to Castle Dimitrescu, the manner in which that tension builds and releases fundamentally changes because of how the gameplay itself changes. It's no longer just a linear, action-oriented romp, but, well, we'll get to that. In addition to each layer of the four lords having a different gameplay theme, the player will be dropped back into the village, and will also be able to explore or return to some optional locations. The player can venture back to Luisa's house twice, for example, to fend off foes and collect new treasures. There are optional sub-bosses the player can brave for the sake of valuable spoils that can be sold. This exploration is encouraged through weapon purchases, crafting blueprints, and upgrades to your arsenal. On a superficial level, this is merely another inspiration from Resident Evil 4, but the manner in which the game's world is designed, more interconnected and allowing for a small amount of exploration off the beaten path, makes it feel as if the concept was better integrated into the overall experience. The player can also find local wildlife or livestock to slaughter and collect the meat of, using it as ingredients for food recipes the Mercantile Duke can prepare to boost Ethan's health, guard efficacy, or speed. It's not the most in-depth system, and on subsequent playthroughs the player has no reason to engage with it anymore outside of selling the meat for money, but it does add an additional goal or distraction to the player beyond just shooting monsters. The question is, does this all fit Resident Evil? Is it a good sequel to this franchise? Honestly, I think Resident Evil Village is less of a greatest hits compilation and more turns this weird, disparate franchise into something consistent with itself. By bringing the action and the horror together, you are able to preserve everything the franchise has been, while simultaneously taking it all into a newer direction, with Resident Evil 7's shift as the catalyst for how everything plays out. I mean, as I go through this analysis, really ask yourself, what is Resident Evil? You already had a split in the fanbase with Resident Evil 4, and it wasn't just a split between horror and action fans. You had players such as myself that liked both. It only makes sense that those visions, those ideas, be merged together, and I think Resident Evil Village does that effectively. However, that's just the overall structure of the game. How does it feel to actually play Resident Evil Village? It doesn't take much to have better combat than Resident Evil 7, at least where the molded are concerned. Resident Evil Village has a far greater variety of enemies stretching throughout its runtime, with environments and arenas that aren't so claustrophobic and allow the player to move around more, and Ethan moves faster now than he did back in Louisiana, victory by default. The problem is, does that make the combat good? Better and good are not necessarily the same thing, and in my usual fashion, I've been banging my head against the wall trying to figure out if Resident Evil Village has good combat or not. I can see reasons why people wouldn't enjoy it, and I can see its limitations. For example, a lot of combat against the molded was just walking backwards and trying to score headshots. When a player first encounters the Moreau, it'll probably be the same thing. You can even say this with the soldat in the factory, while also waiting to see if he'll expose his weak point. Not exactly exhilarating tactical combat. The thing is, any player that uses inefficient tactics is going to end up wasting resources. If your idea of fighting the soldat is to just walk backwards and wait for an opening, you're going to waste time and increase the odds of getting hurt, thus using more healing items. So just because a player can get through the game without making full use of the combat sandbox available to them, does not mean the combat itself is bad. I additionally wondered if the ability to just sprint past certain fights somehow made the combat less effective, but for starters, that's just a legitimate survival horror tactic to conserve ammunition. In fact, it was a standard tactic in the first entries in the series. This game was also clearly designed with speedruns in mind, and you can still struggle and get hurt if you try to run past every enemy. Most of all, however, it's not like the original Resident Evil games were a bastion of combat design. You can argue about the era in which the games are made or whatever, but it's not like there weren't other, better action games at the time. Resident Evil was a success despite having a lesser combat system because they simply needed the combat to be good enough. The term greater than the sum of its parts is a common colloquialism used to describe games with heavy flaws but whose overall experience is still fantastic. With Resident Evil Village, I would say you don't even need that greater than qualifier because it does everything competently or excellently enough, except the story, but we'll get there, that every category by which this game can be measured is in the green. Nothing stands at a deficit. If Resident Evil Village is a downgrade, it is in that Ethan Winters can't roundhouse kick his enemies, nor is there adequate time to knife them while they're on the ground. Chris Redfield may have gotten Ethan some basic combat training between games, but it was very important to the development staff that he not be as powerful or capable as the legacy cast of characters. A struggle to survive was the thematic concept they wanted to chase with the game's combat, and this is made clear in the very first fight Ethan has. 2 of his fingers get bitten off right before he's pitted up against this vicious creature. He then becomes completely surrounded and outnumbered and has to scramble to keep himself from getting killed. I already mentioned that the environments aren't as cramped as Resident Evil 7, and if you study nearly every combat arena in Resident Evil Village, it will be designed for circular routes the player can run and weave through to keep from being cornered. First-time players that scramble into a panic will be able to find safety no matter the situation. Or at least that's the idea, though I imagine the instinct to back away to safety will override and potentially get the player cornered anyway, depending on the environment. When you're first running through a location like the Stronghold though, there's an exhilarating panic as you desperately try to kill everything in front of you, knowing that something could be hot on your heels. It creates that desperate struggle to survive, as is the intent of running from a giant man-eating fish, or watching 2 armored abominations with jetpacks drop in on you. Fear and struggle aside, however, what made Resident Evil 4's combat work as well as it had was the combat sandbox. It was the variety of weapons and tools available that the player could use to their advantage. Ethan is missing Leon's melee prowess, but he at least has an arsenal. In addition, enemies are responsive to the player in their own unique ways. The aforementioned Moreau, for example, will always flinch and snarl when they're just a couple headshots away from death. You can ground the flying Samka temporarily by clipping her wing. Shoot the masks off the haulers and soldats in order to stun them with flash grenades, leaving their weak points exposed. I already mentioned the game's arena design allowing for the player to run in circles, but if you'll recall, I also mentioned in the previous video that the magic of Resident Evil, be it the original or 4, was in that mastery through replayability. Well, these arenas often offer the same thing, with the player able to apply their foreknowledge in ways to more efficiently take their foes out, including on higher difficulties. If you thought the remote bomb was broken in Resident Evil 7, it's even more valuable in Village where you can intentionally place bombs in enemy spawn points, create a defensive perimeter, or lure enemies to where you've planted explosives in order to do incredible damage. Unfortunately, I think the game's greatest flaw is how difficulty is balanced for New Game Plus. The Village of Shadows difficulty is intended to be unlocked after you beat the game once on normal or hardcore. While normal is the intended first time experience, I feel like hardcore is good if you like having a real challenge or want to have something a bit more difficult on a vanilla, purely new game run through without upgrades rolling over. You can do that with Village of Shadows, but it's really not intended given some of the enemy remixing and amount of damage dealt. Having maxed out Magnum hand cannons with infinite ammo is going to make the game easier no matter what the difficulty, but Village of Shadows hits lethally enough that it would be my preferred difficulty to play on for New Game Plus. Otherwise, even returning to hardcore could be made too easy even with the base pistol or shotgun fully upgraded. The problem is, near the game's end, you change perspective to Chris Redfield, and his weapons cannot be upgraded. On normal and hardcore, they're powerful enough that they can make quick work of the hordes of Lycans you'll be forced to go up against, but on Village of Shadows, it's absolutely ridiculous. This was always the weakest part of the game, intended to give you an empowered feeling as Chris Redfield, capable of facing 2 Varkalax at once, if they didn't go down so easy after spamming grenades, and punching Lycans in the face, but everything about his kit feels so limited and impotent once you're facing hordes of werewolves that feel like they spawn indefinitely. I don't think they do, but it sure feels like so long as you hang back, they'll keep sending more your way, and wouldn't you know it, they respawn in the same amount of time it takes to reload your weapon. I can only imagine this is what the game felt like to the playtesters that tried the pre-release builds in 2020. When Resident Evil Village launched, Capcom released a mini featurette explaining how enemies were too numerous and aggressive, and playtesters ended up finding the game mindless as a result and just running out of ammunition. Perhaps the playtesters were misunderstanding the developer's intent, but in this narrow alleyway where Lycans are firing arrows at the player while they keep running up the lane in duos or trios, it just becomes overwhelming and, well, mindless. I love New Game Plus features, and I love using them to challenge harder, remixed versions of the game I've become familiar with. I love that Ethan can die in as few as 2 hits on Village of Shadows as it keeps the stakes high. It contributes to the replayability of Resident Evil Village, even if it could stand for a bit more remixing of the enemies. The problem is, this one section, this portion of the game where they just threw Lycan after Lycan at the player in this narrow corridor, is so frustrating, weak, and quite frankly, uninteresting in terms of its design, it drags the whole thing down. It's a mediocre novelty on normal or hardcore, but on Village of Shadows, it's a slog. To put it another way, the Chris Redfield ride of the theme park is the worst one, and it's mandatory. On the opposite spectrum of challenge, there are several sub-bosses in Resident Evil Village, but most of them can be easily cheesed rather than faced head-on for a unique challenge. The initial Varkolak cinematic sets this beast up as a real threat, but once the player is back in control, they simply need to head outside, snipe the beast for a bit, then duck back inside and maybe take some shots at it through the doorway. The Varkolak outside of Moreau's clinic and Luisa's house are not too different, where staying inside will cause them to return back to their initial spawn position. It's an easy exploit that mitigates the threat these creatures are intended to represent, and it's much the same with the Urias Drac guarding Claudia Beneviento's grave. He'll only go so far up the stairs before turning around and heading back to the grave, leaving the player to take pot shots and avoid the Moroeca that spawn to assist. The only one of these optional sub-bosses I felt forced to engage with was the Urias Drac in Otto's Mill, and only because I never thought to check if the door into the combat arena locks behind me. I just assumed I was trapped in there and thus fought the beast as intended. It continues to be one of my favorite encounters in the game, a perfect example of how the arena design provides space for the player to constantly keep on the move, while also allowing the player to capitalize on their surroundings through explosives and elevation. I just wish I had a reason to use the full arena that the other sub-bosses required like this one does. Lastly, Resident Evil Village reintroduces the Mercenary mode, a sort of score attack horde shooter where the player has to run through the environment netting as many time bonuses as possible while slaughtering enemies close together. It's fun, however it doesn't really capture what makes the base game's combat enjoyable, especially since you can kind of game the system by selling most of your items and focusing on upgrading just one pistol, at least in the early levels. Ammo count becomes an issue in some later maps, but that's also where familiarity comes into play. Memorize where enemies spawn and what bonuses or ammo are in what rooms, and you can get yourself a top score easily. It's not a bad game mode, and I can see coming back to it on occasion for a fun bit of challenge hunting, but it's nothing to really write home about in terms of capitalizing on the game's mechanics. I'll discuss the separate boss fights in their own respective sections of this analysis. However, that should largely cover the combat and my feelings on it. You can argue in favor of the systems in 4, 5, 6, or either Revelations title, but I feel like Village does all it needs to do, especially with Ethan Winters as an average Joe protagonist rather than a legacy cast member. Despite its flaws and shortcomings, I stand by Village offering a good combat sandbox through its arsenal, enemy design, and combat arenas, and it is just one of the many reasons I've enjoyed replaying this game several times over. I want to clarify some things I've seen online while researching Resident Evil 7 and Village. The narrative consultant for Resident Evil 7 was Richard Pearce, who was often credited as the writer for Spec Ops: The Line and Fear. In reality, he was one of many co-writers for Spec Ops: The Line and was only writer for the Fear expansion packs, not the main game. He is also often credited as writer for Resident Evil 7, but in reality, the only interview I could find that clarified his role makes it sound like he was included to polish up and interpret the dialogue after it was translated into English. They specifically wanted to avoid cheesy lines like Jill Sandwich and add some authenticity for the more grounded setting. Simultaneously, Anthony Johnston was hired to help with the script for Resident Evil Village, though with a more involved role. For example, while the character of Alcina Dimitrescu was already created, he helped define some of her background, her personality, and contributed to her English dialogue. Anthony wasn't just polishing things up, nor was he coming up with a plot or creating characters from scratch. He was part of the team. I make this clarification because the way these things are phrased, the writer or the director, oversimplify the origin of these creative ideas. In reality, it is a group effort, though each of these members are crucial. That said, Morimasa Sato, as director, is in charge of things like approval, what to cut, and managing the vision on a macro level. As such, I may go back and forth between crediting Sato himself or the whole development team, but it should be understood either way that I do not imply any one person is purely responsible for what is seen on screen. To that end, because there is a major shift in creative staff and leads from Resident Evil 7, there are many tonal changes despite carrying over certain concepts and themes. For example, family is still very central to Resident Evil Village. Instead of venturing to save his wife Mia, Ethan is now suffering in order to save his baby daughter Rose. Each of the four lords is treated as an adopted child of Mother Miranda, who herself is singularly obsessed with bringing her own daughter that had died long ago back to life. There are several areas where family is still at the heart of Resident Evil Village, but interpreted in a different fashion. This is in part due to the added concept of life, death, and sacrifice. Ethan and Miranda are opposites in this regard, as Ethan is willing to sacrifice a lot in order to secure his daughter's future, while Miranda is willing to sacrifice everyone else. In the opening hour, you hear the villagers offer a prayer to Miranda that pretty much spells out that their entire purpose is to be a sacrifice for Miranda's goals. They've relied on her for protection, but never once thought about the words they've been saying. The problem with trying to trace these themes is that, for the most part, I think they're kind of handled in a sloppy manner. Part of that is bound to be due to the nature of game development, with plenty getting tossed onto the cutting room floor and having to scramble to stitch what's left back together into a coherent whole. However, this is also assuming these are all intentional themes and not just projection. The developers have commented on family being a core concept, as well as the struggle to survive, but life, death, and sacrifice is more an observation on my part. For example, in the beginning we find out Luisa's husband had gone out to seek help. We later find his corpse with a note implying he died of the Varkolak, indicating his effort to sacrifice his own safety to seek help and assistance for his wife in the village. Is it written this way to convey the themes? You can perceive Elena and her father as an intentional pairing to reflect Ethan and his daughter Rose, and perhaps Ethan's fear of Rose's fate, or it can just be a father and daughter pair that are conveniently used for dramatic effect as red shirts with no deeper meaning. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Nonetheless, as I run through each major chunk of the game, I'll cover how each lord embodies these different themes as I perceive them before wrapping it all up in some overall story discussion. To make sure everyone here is on the same page though, let's go over the opening hour. Ethan Winters is enjoying a nice night at home, putting the baby to bed and preparing to dine with his wife Mia when she suddenly gets shot. Chris Redfield and his elite team perform a Chicago drive-by shooting with about a 5% accuracy rating that could easily have gotten Ethan killed, all so they can take out Mia and take Ethan and the baby away without explanation. It is important to note that Mia was clearly behaving oddly during this segment.
We moved here so that she wouldn't have to deal with any of that, remember?
There's nothing wrong with my memory.
And in the flashback, we see it as Mia who seems concerned about Ethan in the past, whereas in the present, she seemed uninterested in worrying about anything until Chris gave her something to worry about. Ethan wakes up in the forest, the transportation wrecked and any phone signal dying and therefore cutting off any means of reaching the outside world. After a much creepy build-up and a gorgeous view of the village, Ethan meets the local denizens, meets the new local denizens, gets conveniently spared from being torn apart by Santa Claus and his army of wolfmen, and manages to find temporary safety with Luisa. The wounded man predictably turns and slaughters everyone, and Ethan makes his way to safety once more as everyone in the village is confirmed dead. Over the river and into the cave, to Miranda's sanctum we go as Heisenberg captures Ethan for a bit of a trial. This is intended to be Village's equivalent to the Baker family dinner, and ultimately Ethan's fate is decided to give the crowd and Lycan some entertainment. Joke's on them, Ethan escapes and manages to make his way to Castle Dimitrescu. This is where I consider the game to really begin. I've come to realize I have a very specific definition in mind of what I consider elegant Metroidvania design, and Castle Dimitrescu is an embodiment of that elegance. As a sort of mansion design full of the trapdoors and unique lock and keys befitting the franchise origins, the player is led through a mostly linear path disguised as being rather open through its environmental design. However, the manner in which it weaves that critical path through the central castle and loops around throughout its extremities disguises that linearity, leading the player from one objective to the next seamlessly while opening up the environment further and further. Everything starts at and continues to loop back around to this main hall, where every door but the critical path is locked. In order to progress forward, the player must descend into the basement dungeon, brave the former servants of the castle transformed into undead thralls by Lady Dimitrescu, and then face off against one of her daughters before obtaining the literal blood wine that grants access to the courtyard key, expanding the area which the player can explore. Now, the player was already introduced to the daughters Dimitrescu, placing one of them behind the player to urge them forward onto the critical path. Once that courtyard key is obtained, a daughter appears and blocks the critical path instead. It is at this point that the castle will contain its own wandering monsters like the prior game, interfering with the player's progress rather than spurning them forward. The environment is designed with plenty of space for the player to flee, and the daughters cannot stand the cold and so will never enter the courtyard or a room whose windows are shattered. From there, the player continues along the critical path, ascending and descending the castle tower until they've made their way to Dimitrescu's chamber, obtaining her castle key only to be forcefully shoved down into the basement. Ethan gets his hand sliced off, the player experiences the imposing stature of Lady Dimitrescu chasing them down, and the first of 4 masks necessary to leave the castle is obtained as Ethan ascends back to the courtyard and reattaches his hand. Don't worry, that last part will make sense later. Twice now, the player traversed a portion of the map that looped right back around to its center, possessing new keys to open more doors, close to the next destination they need to go and explore. However, while the Dimitrescu key can unlock the door to the Opera House immediately in front of the player, they also have the option of heading back to the main hall, ascending to the 2nd floor back towards the dressing room, and going into the Hall of Pleasure to get the mask in there and defeat a second daughter. Or they can enter the Opera Hall first, get the insignia key, defeat a separate second daughter in the library, and then go to the Hall of Pleasure to get the mask there and defeat the final daughter. The third option is to go through the Opera Hall, defeat the daughter in the library and retrieve the mask, and then immediately head for the rooftops to get a separate mask, before then descending to the 1st floor where Lady Dimitrescu will always be approaching from the end of the hall. That third option is what I usually do because the game naturally flows in such a fashion as to lead you there naturally, to the Opera Hall and then to the rooftops. But it still offers you the choice of when to go after the mask in the Hall of Pleasure. Additionally, once you've ascended back up to that courtyard with that first mask, Lady Dimitrescu will begin roaming that main hall and can even follow into the courtyard. So long as at least one of the daughters remain alive, then they can also show up and begin chasing you even while Lady Dimitrescu is roaming around, creating 2 separate wandering monsters to contend with. On the other hand, Lady Dimitrescu will not wander the Opera Hall until you've retrieved the insignia key. This is what makes Castle Dimitrescu so great to me. The level design gives the player options, provides dynamic obstacles the more options are available, and yet is still designed for a smooth, linear flow. However, this could also be for the convenience of speedruns or New Game Plus, as if you never make return trips to the Duke to sell off treasures and potentially expand your attaché case during a fresh new game file, you can easily run out of inventory space. First-time players will naturally be compelled to wander a bit, and therefore will be more likely to run into Lady Dimitrescu and her daughters. Should the player save the Hall of Pleasure for last as well, they can simply take the drop back down into the basement to use the insignia key to collect an optional treasure, and then ascend back up through the kitchen and have a straight shot down the hall to the statues upon which the masks are placed. Which is the other consideration of the map design. If you'll recall, I mentioned that Resident Evil 7 had minimal Metroidvania elements in order to allow for escape from its wandering monsters, as well as the grounded believability of the structure as a house. Well, the player is in a castle now, and as such, the rooms and environments can be designed around safely avoiding wandering monsters like Lady Dimitrescu, while having more freedom to break from realism for the sake of a Metroidvania experience. What's more, depending on the order in which you do things and your choices, you may stumble upon a small interaction that, well, I only saw for the first time myself on one of these playthroughs.
Cassandra, come here now. Enough games! I want that man's head! Now go! Of course, Mother.
Castle Dimitrescu is where I truly began to fall in love with Resident Evil Village, and it is honestly the location I love revisiting the most when I return. It smoothly weaves the player throughout its environment, made speedrunner friendly but also demanding that mastery of your surroundings, not just combat, that the original games demanded. I could easily make a lengthy video just breaking down all the little details of this location alone. Now, before I go into everyone's favorite tall vampire woman, I realize I haven't actually explained how the biological mutations and transformations work in Resident Evil Village. If you recall from the last game, the bakers and molded were caused by an infection of the mold, otherwise known as the mutamycete, a parasitic fungal organism that could be controlled by Evelyn. Well, it turns out the origin of the mutamycete is located right beneath this quaint little village. The megamycete was discovered by Miranda roughly a century ago, and much like Evelyn could control the mold, so too can Miranda. However, Miranda evidently injected all villagers with the mold to more easily monitor and control them, as the mutamycete itself forms a sort of network of consciousness. How do they all not die or transform? How'd they retain some semblance of humanity over the century of experiments she performed? Good question. It'd be nice if the game bothered explaining. In time, Miranda implanted a mutamycete parasite she created into villagers, called a cadeau, a word which means gift in Romanian. Referring to the mold as a gift, huh? This gift grants different transformative properties among the denizens than it had the bakers. Alcina Dimitrescu, who in life had suffered from a blood disease, gained regenerative properties which led to her developing gigantism. However, in order to maintain said regenerative properties, she must ingest human blood and flesh. Now, there's a lot of things going on here in regards to that life and death theme I believe runs through this game, most notably that most of the transformed individuals we see were, in life, dead or dying. This is true also of the daughters Dimitrescu, where the Cato implanted into them infected both flesh and the flies consuming them to merge into a new witchy form. Documents seem to suggest that those in good health, those far from death's door, simply died to the Cato rather than transforming. Those close to death seem to frequently be given new life, though Alcina and her daughters are the only ones among the four lords to suggest such a condition. The rest is found in notes of other village members, and typically in regards to whether they turn into a lichen or some other monstrosity. What shines more clearly with Alcina is that family theme, as family is very clearly important to Alcina. Most of social media may be obsessed with Lady Dimitrescu in a gooning fashion, but what I've come to appreciate is how important it is for her to not just be a daughter of Miranda, but mother of Bella, Cassandra, and Daniela. She wears 3 black roses as a corsage representing each of her daughters, each of whom possess a matching rose tattoo upon their forehead. Simultaneously, if you look closely, each of her daughters bear a similar necklace to the treasure you find that belonged to Lady Dimitrescu, indicating they all wore matching jewelry. Due to the game's design, both the writing and performance had to do a lot of heavy lifting to really establish her character, and while none of the lords get much screen time, Lady Dimitrescu does a lot with a little. This is where I will credit Anthony Johnson with the dialogue, as he did a great job emphasizing Alcina's haughtiness where she literally and figuratively looks down upon her adopted siblings, but also her loyalty to Mother Miranda despite her own feelings and priorities taking over.
Yes, of course, I understand the importance of the ceremony. I won't let you down. Oh! To hell with the ceremony! That man will pay for what he's done.
Of course, credit is also due to the excellent performance of Maggie Robertson, who really brought Alcina to life. She's expressive and filled with emotion, but unlike so much of the rest of the game, she never comes off as campy to me, at least comparatively speaking. I only wish the 3 daughters stood out more. As you can tell, they're all meant to have different personalities, but there's just not enough time or interaction for them to stand out as individuals. As far as the boss fight, or rather fights, the 3 daughter fights are simple yet effective. Even if you haven't been reading the documents scattered through the castle hinting at the dislike of cold, the first encounter reveals the gimmick automatically and gives the player reason to go around breaking windows throughout the castle. The arena in the library, however, doesn't have easily shattered windows, but instead requires the player to pull a lever to open up the ceiling. The final arena demands the player shove a shelf aside to blast the wall open. The daughters have a vicious combo attack, but if the player blocks them, they can shove them back and clear some space like in a regular fight. Simple confrontations, but effective. Lady Dimitrescu, however, is the boss of the castle and the first real boss of the game. As the very name Dracula can be interpreted as Son of the Dragon, the developers chose to give her a bit of a draconic form that the player must continuously run from while taking occasional pot shots at. After doing so much damage, she'll fly into the distance and launch some flies at you, which can be dispersed if you deal enough damage. I struggled to deal enough damage on Village of Shadows difficulty. It's one of those fights that will have most players swapping weapons out, trying to deal as much damage as they can, which is kind of just what Resident Evil boss fights are. Even before Resident Evil 4, the franchise has kind of made a name on shooting giant monstrosities in their weak point while running in circles trying not to get hurt, and they've somehow managed to keep it entertaining by simply putting a lot of pressure on. So long as getting hit once is devastating to your health, it gives the player reason to keep running and shooting while feeling the intense adrenaline of facing a superior force. Lady Dimitrescu isn't a complicated fight, but it's an effective and enjoyable one. All in all, Castle Dimitrescu is probably the best location in the entire game. It's the theme park ride everyone talks about and everyone wants to go back to. It has the structure, the characters, the performances, the world-building documentation, and several varieties of tense atmosphere. It's a shame no other section comes together as perfectly as this does. If Castle Dimitrescu is effectively Dracula's castle, then House Beneviento is a haunted house and forest. In fact, it was originally planned to be a ghost family of sorts until they worked things down to being just Donna Beneviento, last surviving member of her line. I find her location to be a bit all over the place thematically while coming off as consistent with itself. It's a split focus of Donna Beneviento as a character and Mia, though from the perspectives of both Ethan and Donna. Unfortunately, while there's plenty of documentation to give a clear background on Lady Dimitrescu's origins, Donna's history is a bit more vague. We know her father died, but we don't know when. Just that he had gifted Donna her beloved doll Angie, which inspired her to make her own dolls. Her mother tossed herself off the waterfall cliff, but we don't know when or why. There's a Claudia Beneviento, but evidently the fandom is torn on whether this was Donna's sister or her own daughter. For the sake of simplicity, I am going to assume that Claudia was Donna's sister, and it was the death of Claudia as a child that drove Mama Beneviento into depression and a swan dive over the falls. Her father perhaps died during flu season, which seemed to be what led many villagers to Mother Miranda for the so-called cure that was actually a mold injection. Either way, Donna was left alone with her butler and became a recluse with a scar on her face. Miranda placed a cadeau in her head, which led to Donna emitting a type of pheromone linked with a specific breed of mold-infected flower. Using this pheromone, Donna can create hallucinations in those exposed to the pollen and spores of the flower, which is precisely what happens to Ethan as he enters and approaches the forest. A fitting power for a woman so damaged that she speaks purely through her doll, one of many that she had placed pieces of her cadeau into so that she could control them from afar, speaking and acting through visions and dolls rather than acting herself. Now, in the castle, we technically learn that Mother Miranda wants Ethan alive for some kind of ceremony, even if it was never directly spoken to the player. Donna's motivation with the hallucinations and haunted house, then, is to capture and retain Ethan from Mother Miranda, which we can intuit through the only line Donna actually speaks.
Don't leave. I can't let you.
In terms of character, Donna doesn't get much, and projection and speculation is about all you can do. She is grateful to Mother Miranda, but doesn't seem to want her approval or favoritism like Dimitrescu or Moreau. As such, my initial read into the escape room that is her haunted house is that it thematically focuses on Ethan and his relationship with Mia and Rose. I mean, that makes the most sense, right? It's a doll of Mia the player is forced to take apart. It's her wedding ring that has their anniversary etched onto it. The music player that was a wedding gift is used to obtain a key item. Ethan is desperately looking to save his baby daughter Rose, so of course there's not only terrifying imagery of a baby crib that collapses and shatters, but a giant monster fetus that chases him down. However, this picture frame, this particular image that just snaps in time to jump scare the player, it just gets me thinking about Donna's mother. The visual of a pregnant woman hanging by the neck brings to mind how Donna's mother passed away. In that light, there's a lot about what Ethan goes through that can seem just as reflective of Donna's own trauma and damage. I mean, while there are elements that tie to Mia being Ethan's wife, there are also aspects that tie to her being a mother, which is something Donna had taken from her. If Angie is also the vehicle through which Donna expresses herself, then we also get a sense of her loneliness and desire to connect to others in a stunted, childish fashion.
I've been waiting for so long. I'd make a much better daughter than Rose. Please, won't you stay with me forever?
What?
The problem is, if these ideas are all presented within House Beneviento, they're not as neatly stitched together as Lady Dimitrescu and her daughters are. That's why this could all be projection. It's kind of like how Donna is dressed in mourner's garb, but Angie is in what looks to be a wedding dress. It could represent the life and death theme, but the art directors themselves state it leans into the Beneviento house symbol of the sun and moon, which also matches the scars on both Donna and Angie's faces. These sorts of themes and meaning are sort of thrown on rather than illustrated in any effective fashion. Alcina Dimitrescu may have gotten a lot of attention and even been established early on, but Donna Beneviento seems to have gone through so many adjustments and changes through development that they never landed on anything consistent thematically. Well, aside from being a creepy ghost girl in a haunted house. Nonetheless, House Beneviento became viral after Resident Evil Village's release due to the horrifying monster lying within. The game wisely removes the player's weapons after they've no doubt gotten comfortable with mass monster murder, leaving them defenseless as they proceed to solve continuously disturbing puzzles. There's definitely a sense of dread to be felt watching footage descend down into a dark, stone basement and gaze into a well, only for the player to have to make that same descent themselves. Of course, the greatest reason this location went viral was because of the horror that chases you. Again, the player is unarmed and unable to defend themselves. The only way to survive is to run, and if you've never played this game before, then you won't know how this creature operates. which is kind of the weakness of House Beneviento. The first time through, it's great. It's completely effective and scary and fills the player with jitters. On follow-up playthroughs, however, it becomes clear how limited this entire section is. There's only one step the player can really skip if they're hoping to speedrun, and by skipping that step they may actually leave a door locked and slow them down further when it comes time to run from the giant monster fetus. Regardless of speedrunners or not, however, the fetus does despawn on the first 2 scripted chases. Once the player knows the different tricks they can pull off, it just becomes a matter of easy execution. The only point they can screw up, as I admittedly had on a playthrough, is the very end to get into the elevator. Even then, you have to do a pretty major screw up given the generous timing should you know what you're doing. Getting a good look at the baby fetus also eliminates some of its horror. This attempted jump scare at the end just makes it look not scary. I don't know how to describe it. It's not that it looks silly, but it removes that threat of the unknown. Whatever I conjured in my head is far more frightening. The boss fight of House Beneviento is hardly a fight at all. Fitting for someone suffering such arrested development as Donna, our confrontation with her and Angie takes the form of a hide-and-seek game. From what I can tell, Angie will always spawn upstairs first, with somewhat randomized locations after. You can sometimes tell which direction she's going after stabbing her with the scissors, a tool Donna no doubt used to stitch and sew her doll's outfits together, but otherwise the biggest hint the player must rely on is Angie's audible gasp. If you don't find her in time, then the player gets cut up by Donna's other dolls. The increased clacking and chattering they make adds unnerving pressure the longer it takes the player to find Angie. I've pondered if this is ultimately an homage to the hook hand build of Resident Evil 4, but from what I've found, no developer has officially commented on this. Either way, Angie, and by extension Donna, go down easy and the haunted house is finished. A suitable theme park attraction that allows the player to take a break from constantly solving problems with a gun. Moreau is the weakest of the 3 lords in every conceivable way. The most enjoyable aspects of his section are where you just fight some lichens. The little shack with the boat key is one of those arenas that may seem threatening at first, but on replay allows the player to more efficiently plan their move and take control of the environment to ambush the would-be ambushers. Instead, the focus of the section is running across Flotsam in the water, evading the monstrous fish form of Moreau before then tackling him as a boss fight. The sprinting across the water is supposed to be hectic and cinematic, but so long as you try and rush forward, you'll simply drop into the water, get swallowed whole, and have to do it again. The best move is to be patient and take your time, testing and learning Moreau's behaviors before rushing across. The only segment that is, in any way, hectic are the levers to control the colored platforms, because there you do need to be quick and thus it is easy to get flustered and panic. While you can argue House Beneviento is at least effective on a first time through, I don't think Moreau's little chase is effective on any run through the game. This is, by far, the weakest segment, but it's also at least brief. The same can be said for Moreau's boss fight, which is not too different from Lady Dimitrescu's, but with a few tweaks. Moreau's weak point is not constantly exposed. You have to coax it out with explosives, which is where first time players seem to struggle the most. The mines, pipe bombs, explosive grenades, these are quite costly in regards to crafting resources, meaning less skilled players may easily run out of ammo and supplies. There are explosive barrels, ammunition, and resources around the environment, but it's a hectic fight where the player must stay on the move and can't remain still for too long. It's easy to miss these while in a panic. That said, these are only problems if there's a blatant skill issue involved. If you're having trouble with ammunition and resources, then perhaps you're just playing on too high a difficulty. Otherwise, it's fitting to introduce a boss this far into the game that's a more dangerous variant of a prior one, demanding more skill and greater use of your arsenal. No, my issue comes with Moreau bloating his body up. Once he's in this form, no explosive will expose his weak point. You just have to wait until he vomits all the acid out, which can clip through walls and hit you even behind cover. That is what frustrates me. Just how much of this fight ends up being waiting, and how this blatant clipping issue passed through QA. Moreau also has 2 phases where he'll climb to the top of a building and spew acid rain, during which the player will need to duck underneath some cover to avoid taking constant damage. Moreau can take damage here as well, though not nearly as much as if his weak point was exposed. If you got infinite ammo and a maxed out magnum, you can actually do so much damage he'll jump from the first rooftop phase directly into the second, spilling his next round of acid rain. Once you know what you're doing, the fight isn't so bad, but whereas Lady Dimitrescu had so much excellent build-up, and to an extent, so do Donna and Angie despite not really being a fight, Moreau ends up being a lame set piece followed by a boss fight that has become notorious for putting first-timers through the ringer. If the acid vomit didn't clip through walls, and if he could more effectively coax Moreau out of his bloated bipedal form, or if his weak point was more reliably exposed when spewing acid rain, I feel like the fight would work a lot better. As for Moreau himself, perhaps fitting for his character, he's the lord that gets the least characterization or development. It's uncertain what he was before Mother Miranda put the Cato inside of him, but he clearly drew the short straw in terms of transformation. Given he has a clinic, it is possible he was once a doctor. That fish form on his back is actually his brain, mutated into its own life form just about, which could suggest Moreau's simpleton nature is a curse from Miranda's gift. Rather than making him smarter, it may have lobotomized him. Nonetheless, he's smart enough to lure Ethan into a cardinal sin of game writing, making the player character do something dumber than the player ever would.
What's so funny?
You're stupid. You talk too much. It's all over. I plugged away in.
What do you...
If I wanted to draw some semblance of life, death, or sacrifice from Moreau, there's honestly not much to go off of. It would very easily feel more like projection than anything else so far. He simply took villagers and inserted the Cato into them to see what would happen. The goal was to find a suitable vessel for Miranda's daughter, but there's nothing to indicate Moreau performed actual experiments. He was just a dumb fishman with a low self-esteem and desire to be favored by Miranda. Even in terms of the stated family theme, he offers nothing. Before going to Heisenberg's factory, the player must first traverse the Lycan stronghold and take out the leader Urias. It is a far more effective set piece than Moreau's Lake, but it's also pretty straightforward. You can try to charge through and rush towards the entrance, running in circles to buy time and survive while the gate is opening, or you can take your time step by step as there's only a limited number of enemy spawns per phase. Each of these big chambers are fine combat arenas that convey that struggle to survive, pressuring the player forward and creating potential choke points that they can get trapped in if they're not careful. The fight against Urias is also an enjoyable one that feels more cramped than it actually is, allowing plenty of space and pillars for the player to circle around and avoid the big man's giant hammer. It's an intense, action-oriented sequence before heading into Heisenberg's factory, and thus the final major location of Resident Evil Village. The factory also has a Metroidvania design to it, but more labyrinthine and overall more linear. Whereas Castle Dimitrescu focused very much on looping back to either the main hall or courtyard, Heisenberg's factory focuses on a vertical path upwards that loops back towards an elevator shaft. Whereas the exit for Castle Dimitrescu was in the main hall where you started, the exit for the factory is on the top floor while Ethan begins at the bottom. The map always loops back higher than where you started as opposed to where you started. Additionally, now that the player has a far more developed arsenal of weaponry, the factory becomes more focused on challenging combat set pieces. This is where the Moreau are changed to the mask-wearing hauler, and the various Soldat creations stomp intently towards the player to puncture them with a drill arm. Despite the greater focus on combat arenas, there are still plenty of optional treasures to find. I hope you have enough resources to make pipe bombs or grenades, because they'll be necessary for wrecking some walls and uncovering some goodies. You could also consider this factory as an homage to the infamous underground lab level of classic Resident Evil games, as it kinda fits that trope with Heisenberg being the mad scientist developing the diabolical machines and monsters with the intent to conquer the world. You know, typical evil villain stuff. What I think may be an interesting inclusion, however, is the need to craft your own keys. Typically in these games, you find an object that acts as a key that allows you access to a new area, but with the factory you have to find molds that you use in the foundry to craft the object or key you need. I kind of wish they did a bit more with this, such as finding parts of molds that can be mixed and matched to create unique, optional keys or treasures. It's a neat thematic twist, but in terms of gameplay, it's just backtracking all the same. It'll just be darker and spookier when you have to backtrack for the last time. But I do find it clever that, after crafting the final key, the player has at least 2 routes they can take to return to the elevator platform, and a Soldat Panzer will spawn at either potential exit the player attempts to take, but only that potential exit. As for Carl Heisenberg, the man behind the factory, despite his lack of a clear background, I find him a fascinating antagonist. You see, Heisenberg is a hypocrite. He hates Miranda and wants to kill her, but he is guilty of everything he accuses her of. For example, Heisenberg claims that Miranda robbed him of his dignity while simultaneously claiming she has lost her humanity. Yet, Carl Heisenberg himself desecrates the deceased by turning them into abominable living weapons, including stripping himself of his own humanity in order to change to a mechanized monstrosity. Despite this hypocrisy, Heisenberg is the most intelligent of the four lords in that he recognized Miranda's nonsensical plan. Earlier in the game, Miranda had crystallized Rose and split her into 4 separate pieces kept inside jars given to each of the four lords. The retrieval of all of these jars, well, I'll let Heisenberg explain it.
Lady, supersized bitch. Ugly ass psycho doll. An embryonic freak. Don't you get it? It's a test. To see if you're strong enough to be a part of Miranda's family.
I don't want to be a part of Miranda's family.
Neither did I, but here we are. And I'm next in line, right? Kill me, move up the chain. Well, fuck that!
Now, we'll go over the nonsensical stupidity of this plan later. Going back to that trial, however, it can be insinuated that Heisenberg was already aware of Miranda's intentions when he sought to make Ethan flee for entertainment.
Let's see what you do. Ethan Winters. Get ready.
If Miranda wanted Ethan alive as a test or whatever, then of course she'd choose the option that gave Ethan the greatest chance to survive. Heisenberg himself seems to have been testing Ethan, which is why his jar was kept in the stronghold away from where Heisenberg resides. As such, he could offer to unite with Ethan to kill Miranda and then use his daughter Rose to conquer the world, which naturally Ethan was never going to agree to, which is why Heisenberg may be smart for a Resident Evil villain, but that's a very, very low bar to clear. I find Heisenberg interesting, but I'm not sure I like him. There's a kernel of a smart and clever antagonist in there, but he just doesn't seem as smart as I think the developers were hoping for. Plus, I know Neil Newbon is a beloved voice actor, but his delivery is perhaps a bit too hammy at points. For a man trying to insist Ethan can trust him, he can't help but deliver each line with threatening sarcasm.
Don't worry about the kid, Ethan. It'll be fine. Ha!
I'd like to speak to you about Rose and Miranda. Oh, come on in. Don't worry. It's not a trap.
That said, there's so little else to go off of for Heisenberg that his performance really does do all the heavy lifting. There's no real history to his character, no real reason given for why he was chosen to be infected with the Cat-O, and nothing to characterize him outside of the cutscenes, his constant speeches over the loudspeaker, and one audio log where he brings a soldat to life. He's got less to work with than Lady Dimitrescu certainly did, and yet is one of the 2 more memorable antagonists purely due to his presence in cutscenes. I'm comfortable giving Neil Newbon credit for that. As for themes, the story of Dr. Frankenstein was the core inspiration by the developers when crafting the character and his soldat army. The portrayal of life and death is very clear, as the undead troopers are corpses brought back to life through unnatural means. They are the walking dead, living by the most basic definition possible. As for family, well, he rejects the family, but in that rejection he also most closely resembles Mother Miranda. He would sacrifice and use anyone else for his own singular gains just as she would. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, and Heisenberg takes after Mother Miranda far more than he'd no doubt care to admit. There are technically 2 separate boss fights in Heisenberg's factory, his motorized monster Sturm and Heisenberg himself. Sturm is introduced to the player twice, and in situations where the player is expected to hurriedly flee to avoid being chopped up by a propeller. A bit of a build up before the player is forced to face Sturm in a confined space where he can shatter through the brick walls. On a first time through, this fight may be intimidating, but on subsequent playthroughs, Sturm is actually a bit of a chump. The player can even bait him into destroying all of the walls and clearing out the combat arena before blinding him with flash grenades, causing him to charge in a random direction and expose his weak point for an extended period of time. He has clear audio cues that indicate he's revving to charge forward or to spew out a cone of flames, both of which can be easily dodged. There is satisfaction in figuring out the trick to Sturm, but once you know that trick, it feels a bit too easy to exploit his vulnerabilities and breeze through the fight. While figuring out a foe's weakness should always mitigate the difficulty somewhat, pulling off those exploits and tricks should still require some degree of skill. As stated earlier, Heisenberg himself becomes more machine than man, transforming into an instrument of war. His fight is simple, though I feel the trick is simply to be accurate. I honestly still struggle a bit with him, trying to maintain some degree of cover while shooting at one of 3 weak points. The player only gets so many opportunities to block his attacks before being killed, as there's no way to heal while you're on your own makeshift tank. I'm sure there are precise timings or movements you can do to avoid his swings without blocking, but if there's a secret to this particular fight beyond the obvious, then I haven't found it. Nonetheless, it can be a fun and exciting clash, a man using a machine to take on a man that has become a machine. Curiously, the easiest part of the fight is when you lose your tank and are on foot, as Heisenberg will halt and flinch at every shot to his face. Altogether, I consider Heisenberg a pretty strong finish to the game's primary content. You get another Metroidvania, but interpreted differently from how Castle Dimitrescu had done it. The enemies demand you put a bit more thought into your arsenal, environment, and tactics, and you finish off with 2 decent boss fights, even if one's challenge can be significantly mitigated. If the game cut right to the final boss here, I'd be happy. Unfortunately, that's not what the game does. I will admit, there is some kind of Chad energy to Chris Redfield that lets him get away with a lot of stupidity. From the very beginning, it feels like he's playing his cards all wrong. From risking Ethan as collateral damage with his sloppy drive-by style assassination, to giving absolutely no context or explanation to Ethan, nor being absolutely certain the actually not Mia but a powerful mold-infected Miranda was fully incapacitated. I mean, come on Chris, you've been doing this for how many years now? You didn't even double tap in the skull. While I greatly appreciate Roger Craig Smith's performance of Chris Redfield the past generation of games, I'll certainly say I appreciate Jeff Shine's interpretation of the character. He comes off a bit too Brooklyn at points, but he certainly sounds both authoritative and exhausted when he needs to. Melodramatic too. I don't like how every voice actor is being replaced in this new generation of Resident Evil, but this guy does a good job and is probably one of the reasons he has enough charisma to carry through the character's baffling choices. Now, people have excused Redfield's actions, claiming he could not have reasonably warned Ethan ahead of time because he had no way of knowing if Ethan himself was already compromised. The problem with this explanation is, why would Miranda continue putting on a facade if he had been compromised? She's only putting on the facade because Ethan thinks she's the real Mia. Additionally, it doesn't explain why you just knock Ethan out, nor why you and your special operations unit wouldn't somehow come into contact with Ethan during the events of the game. Ethan is frequently stumbling upon where Redfield's team sets up, be it at the small chapel in the middle of town, some cave in the remote corner of the village outskirts, or literally stumbling upon them in a cave right before Moreau attacks. Chris Redfield tries a second time to get Ethan to stop chasing after Rose, but clearly at any point his team could have made contact with Ethan and, I don't know, established something more organized and potentially less life-threatening for the civilian. I think the worst part about all this, after Ethan seemingly gets killed by Miranda, don't worry, we'll get to that soon, we're almost there, Chris Redfield is smoking a cigarette and groaning exasperatedly, asking, when does it end? It's that taste of Resident Evil 6 Chris again, and I mean, man, it's your fault, and the game even acknowledges it.
I know it's too late now, but we really should have told Ethan the plan.
There wasn't time, and we didn't expect Miranda to act so soon.
Even so, you should have told him.
In the last video, I praised Resident Evil 7 a lot for what it did with the themes and narrative. While I acknowledge there were traces of typical Resident Evil stupidity, it was largely left in the background, which helped make the story the best in the entire franchise. With Resident Evil Village though, that's just absolutely not the case, and it all begins with Chris Redfield. That isn't to say the game is completely bereft of good writing or characters, as that same opening scene has a number of good and clever moments. The problem is that, compared to Resident Evil 7, the dumb lore and character decisions that plague this entire franchise are once more prominent, including the origins of the Umbrella logo. Not even the origins of Umbrella, either. The symbol is derived from the 4 bloodlines that effectively ruled the valley this village is located in, and not much information is given beyond that. You'll find treasures connected to the lineage of the 4 houses, and each of the current 4 lords, Dimitrescu, Beneviento, Moreau, and Heisenberg, are somewhat descended from these old houses, but that tidbit never actually matters to the plot or setting. Instead, at the very end of the game you discover that Oswald Spencer, the big bad of Umbrella Corporation, had come to this village as a young man and worked with Miranda in studying the Mutamycete. However, he decided to chase the progenitor flowers in Africa rather than the mold, using that symbol of the 4 houses as his corporate logo. Which means this was merely included to explain the origins of the logo, Not even to explore Spencer's motivations of evolution and immortality, as he finds the Mutamycete too limiting to his actual goals, not even starting Umbrella in this valley. Just that he was here, saw the symbol, and thought that'd make an awfully nice logo. It's stupid, it's unnecessary, and if you remove both the Umbrella logo and the notes by Spencer in Miranda's lab, nothing of value would be lost. It literally serves no purpose except to wiki addicts that think because this exists, it somehow deepens the lore. No, it just makes the lore all the more stupid and convoluted. If you're gonna be dumb, you could have at least been the good kind of dumb like Resident Evil 4. So, after Heisenberg's factory, Ethan is confronted by Miranda in a monologue that explains little and, in hindsight, develops more questions. She rips Ethan's heart out and kills him, which is when Chris Redfield begins his operation, Miranda begins her ceremony, and Mia is discovered in prison just beyond the Megamycete. The game never comes out and says it, but it's clear Mia knew Ethan was infected with the mold this whole time, but never knew how to address it. Once again, she's keeping a secret from her husband, though instead of being about her, it's about him. Looking back at the game's opening, they did a good job giving the player a sense of unease about Miranda as Mia without making it too obvious. That sudden snap about her memory, cooking a local dish and drinking local wine. But the greatest hint that it's not Mia is how she takes that first bullet. No pain, just defensive hostility. The thing is, despite her presence being littered throughout the game, from her taking Mia's place to her disguised as the old crone, Miranda's plan doesn't actually make much sense. She wants to revive her daughter via the Megamycete because it catalogs everyone which dies from it or is infected. It's basically a mold database, and it is through this Mutamycete network that Jack Baker and Ethan were able to speak in the last game. That Ethan has this vision with Evelyn revealing he's been dead this whole time, and Evelyn was able to influence and control people. The problem is, Miranda's daughter Ava died of the Spanish flu. The game plainly states this. There's no reason her daughter would have been cataloged at all, so trying to revive her daughter through some vessel, be it the Four Lords, the many villagers, Evelyn, or Rose, should not feasibly work because Ava had no connection to the Megamycete. What's more, Heisenberg claims Miranda had Ethan killing off the other lords in order to test and see if he was good enough to be part of her family, but Miranda simply describes Ethan as a lab rat. Okay, I'm cool with Heisenberg misinterpreting Miranda's motivations, but what exactly was she hoping to accomplish putting Ethan through all this? Weren't there more efficient ways that didn't involve letting Ethan kill each of the lords? Why did Miranda kill all the villagers anyway as soon as she had Rose? What would happen if Ethan died, stayed dead, and Ava still wasn't reborn through Rose? After Resident Evil 7 told a simple, family-focused story that largely worked until you got to the DLC, Resident Evil Village returns to all the worst, idiotic traits of the franchise. I give credit to actress Michelle Lukes for providing a perfectly hammy performance. You can tell she's putting her all into it, but this villain is just foolish and contradictory. Perhaps that's the point, perhaps she's just another mad villain with wild machinations to take over the world. But after putting this much effort into the presentation and the Four Lords themselves, it's kind of disappointing for it to all fall apart with the actual antagonist driving the whole thing. Now, in regards to the game's themes, I originally thought of Miranda and Ethan as being mirrors of one another and even suggested as much earlier, but in hindsight, while I think that's the intention, the two are actually kind of similar. Miranda was willing to sacrifice any and all to bring her daughter back, and Ethan kind of proves he's willing to do the same. He murders Lady Dimitrescu's daughters for the sake of finding his own, though, well, at least everyone else is trying to kill Ethan first. After all, we see him trying his best to help and save Elena in the game's opening, so he doesn't want to just leave someone behind if there's a chance they could survive. Much like in Resident Evil 7, he's just an average guy driven to desperate and dark measures to secure the safety of himself and his family. Let's return to the fact that Ethan is already dead. I suggested earlier that the infection seems to work best with those dead or dying, such as Lady Dimitrescu and her daughters, and Ethan was certainly dead. In a franchise that started out with killing undead, we now play as an undead that is kept alive through the Mutamycete. Rather poetic. Miranda points out Rose is the child of two particular parents, and while she highlights Ethan as being particularly special, we must recall that Mia was infected as well, and while she was given the serum to heal the infection, it could have contributed to whatever makes Rose so special. Clearly, Rose has the mutamycete in her as well, and has the potential to be more powerful than Evelyn or Miranda. As the game progresses, we get hints to Ethan's undead nature, such as Lady Dimitrescu referring to his blood as tasting a little stale, or Miranda in her crone form questioning how one can be almost dead. Ethan is also able to see fragments of Rose's own memories from when she was taken by Miranda and when she was presented before the Four Lords, indicating father and daughter have a connection through the mutamycete network. We also see Ethan take on more severe wounds than he even did in Resident Evil 7, starting with getting 2 of his fingers bitten off. Curiously, this leaves him with 8 fingers the whole game. Village is the 8th entry in the series. If you want to try and make silly connections, there are 8 partitions in the Umbrella logo, and while the red partitions are supposed to symbolize the Four Lords, there are also 4 rose jars, adding up to 8. What does it all mean? Nothing of substance or value, just silly, meaningless observations. In addition to losing his fingers, however, his being infected the whole time helps recontextualize reattaching his hand, getting stabbed and jabbed with sharp implements, and even getting mauled by a Varkulak while being able to shake it all off with some first aid ointment. The removal of Ethan's heart seems to be the last straw. He's able to keep moving for a bit longer, but his body is clearly starting to fall apart, as the generous Duke observes. He is dying, and all he can do is use the last of his life to save Rose. The game ends with his ultimate sacrifice, though you could argue it's not much of a sacrifice if he was just going to die anyway. Capcom is finally willing to kill off a playable character, and I can't really say if this moment was worth it or not because it's too early to tell. On a superficial level, I think it's fine. Ethan was intentionally written to be a bit more of a blank canvas for the player to project themselves onto, but unfortunately he would frequently act in somewhat stupid ways. It's hard to empathize when you're watching the guy impotently whack his gravely wounded 3-fingered hand against the windowsill, knowing that it would hurt like a son of a gun. But when pitted against Mother Miranda, it's easy to feel what he feels, and everyone likes a self-sacrificing father willing to die so his wife and child can see a brighter tomorrow. How well this sacrifice will work in the long term, well, that depends on what happens with Rose. From what I could gather, the fan reaction to the Shadows of Rose DLC was largely negative in part due to its pricing, and I can understand that. While I think it is overall better than either Not a Hero or End of Zoe for Resident Evil 7, those actually provided new levels and combat mechanics where you could punch a molded in the face. Shadows of Rose is a complete asset flip, and while it offers some neat ideas with those recycled assets, it's ultimately a 2.5 to 3 hour experience, and for $20, I can see feeling a bit ripped off. Granted, it also came with new content for Mercenaries mode, but I think most players were hoping to get more story content that shed a bit more light on some characters and, in particular, gave us a sense of Rose's powers. Which is where I think the DLC stumbles, because Rose wants to get rid of those powers the whole time. I am never going to understand the I just want to be normal plotline of anyone with superpowers unless it's something like Rogue from X-Men, where she literally can't touch people without doing harm. Rose just wants to be normal because the girls at school are mean, which, again, I can't relate. I was in middle school when I realized the people bullying me aren't good people and therefore not worth befriending. So from the get-go, I'm feeling removed from our teenage girl protagonist who just wants to be normal so the mean girls like her. It is this desire to be normal that allows the spirit or essence of Miranda, preserved in a sample of Megamycete through its infected people database network thing, to bait Rose into that spirit essence Megamycete network thing with the promise of a mold power remover. Now, trapped in a world of memory, Rose gets to wander through recycled environments where the only new enemies are actually just reskins of Moreau and Urias Drac. Which is honestly underselling it, because the DLC is actually more effective as a survival horror experience than Resident Evil Village is. Rose is less combat proficient than her father ended up being, and resources are more light than the base game. The player is far more encouraged to use the environment to circle around and avoid enemies rather than fight them, though there are still moments the player will be either forced or encouraged to fight. At most, Rose can only freeze or incapacitate enemies with her powers, and she only has a limited amount of energy with which to do so, and the recovery item for said energy is uncommon. This is a DLC that wants the player to feel at risk and endangered as much as possible. This is most effective when Evelyn, who dwells in this Megamycete world as well, traps Rose in Beneviento's house, a sort of stealth puzzle section where you need to figure out how to avoid the patrols of the dolls and, more importantly, the Mia mannequin. Even when Rose returns to her normal size, this Mia mannequin is the most unnerving thing in the whole of Resident Evil Village. If the greatest issue with the monster fetus was how easily you could outrun it, and how knowing what it looks like diminishes how frightening it seems, then the Mia mannequin is the solution. The player has to constantly play red light, green light, where the mannequins will stop moving so long as the player has their eyes on them, which naturally means they start throwing more and more mannequins at you the further you go. Their quick, jittery movements and the glow of their eyes just gets under my skin, and that you can't simply run away from them but have to continuously engage with them makes them far more effective than the monster fetus. Throughout her journey, Rose will be guided by a guardian angel named Michael that is obviously the spirit of Ethan. If you ever wondered how Rose could have such strong feelings for her dad in the post-credits scene despite his dying when she was only 6 months old, well, Shadows of Rose tries to answer it for you. Really, that's the only narrative purpose the DLC has, since Rose wanting to be normal is kind of a manufactured motivation, and there are plenty of other ways you could have explained her discovering what she's capable of. Being super supportive, however, Ethan is willing to help Rose uncover this cure despite wanting nothing more than for her to leave and stay out of danger, all the way up until his Spirit Essence Network presence shows up to help fend off Miranda. I must be a sucker because the development of Rose's relationship with her father did work for me in a way her motivation to be normal did not. It also once again creates a mirror to Miranda, who not only remains wanting to use Rose to revive her daughter Ava, but even continues to ignore and reject Evelyn, viewing her as a failure. Who knew the DLC would help develop Evelyn just a bit more, presenting her as hateful and jealous of Rose because Miranda wants her instead. Miranda has an opportunity to have a loving daughter once more, but is so clouded by expectations built upon her own desire for conquest, that she can't see what's in front of her. She sees Evelyn for what she's not instead of who she is or what she could be. Ethan and Rose, meanwhile, establish that positive relationship, brief as it may be, and Rose finally accepts her powers so she can save what memory of her father remains within the Megamycete. Again, the DLC is a giant asset flip, but in addition to the unique mechanics in House Beneviento, they don't just repeat the Miranda boss fight. While they still recycle certain attacks and animations, it's more focused on timing Rose's attacks to smack Miranda down until she doesn't stand back up again. Here at the climax, Rose finally accepts her powers, connects with a father she never knew, and leaves the Megamycete as the Rose we saw in the post-credits scene. If you're going to play Resident Evil Village, I think this DLC is worth experiencing at least once, both for that stealth section and the horrifying chase of the Mia mannequins, and for some development of Rose's love for her father. Otherwise, that post-credits scene is just kind of weird, considering how old she was when he died. However, I can't see much reason to play it more than once. Even in terms of survival horror, I feel like I prefer what Resident Evil 7 is doing. Shadows of Rose was effectively an experiment, and now that I got my narrative explanation for Rose to remember and love her dad, I'm good. You'd have to be really into what this DLC is doing to want to come back. Of course, I find the greater problem to be that they tease an older Rose and her powers, but considering the game's timeline, Shadows of Rose and the post-credits scene would all have to take place around 2036 or later. Unless this series does a time jump after Resident Evil 9, you can't really do anything with Rose yet. Then again, it's not like this series hasn't introduced and then promptly forgotten promising characters before. In a featurette Capcom released during the game's launch, Tomonori Takano discussed how the Village of Shadows storybook allowed the team to tie any elements in the game together into one whole. In other words, thematic coherence could be an illusion propped up by the storybook that makes it seem like it was all intentional the whole time. I think this is ultimately what makes Resident Evil Village frustrating despite how much I love it. As that amusement park of horror, it brings together all kinds of varied gameplay mechanics that leave me feeling like I'm doing something new or different from start to finish. Each location is not just a more difficult version of the last. They're all unique in their own way, propped up by the core combat mechanics at their center. Narratively though, the game's all over the place. There are hints of themes and ideas, but they aren't really consistent with one another because so much got scrapped and changed during development. That's just the nature of making games, right? Yet Resident Evil 7 managed it more effectively and was scrambled together in just 2.5 years. Or perhaps the real frustration is that, despite the less grounded turn that Resident Evil Village takes, it could have still told a good personal story without being bogged down by typical Resident Evil idiocy. I mean, why does Miranda need to have some world-conquering desire? Why can't she simply be solely focused on bringing her daughter back, as it still stands as a real threat to Rose and therefore Ethan? Why did Chris Redfield need to be involved? Why is the BSAA using zombies now? Why did the Umbrella logo need to be here? Nonetheless, despite the game's many flaws, I still find it my favorite to play. As blasphemous as it is to say, I enjoy playing the game more than Resident Evil 4 original or remake, even though you could argue it is a more flawed product than either. There's just something about how Village is designed that makes me want to take a magnifying glass to its every nook and cranny, even after making this incredibly lengthy video. If you didn't care for Resident Evil Village before, then I hope this video at least shines a new light on it that you can be willing to give it another try, or at least appreciate what it's doing. Ultimately, I do think it successfully merges everything I like about this franchise into one package, even if it also includes some of the greatest series flaws with it. Either way, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again.
See